Good morning. Greetings. Uh, Ephraim Davis. Peace to your family. You're the first one to log in for the chats. Greetings to the Dr. Obachashaka show. How's everybody doing? I hope that all of you have been enjoying the shows and getting something out of it. I certainly have, though it's hard work. There's a lot of prep that goes into each one of these shows. Just to give you a little background in terms of how this show works, in terms of the issues that we address and the way they're brought up. In some ways, I'll pick the topic kind of like in a jazz-like fashion based on what I'm feeling. But when I get into a subject, then it usually will lead me to an extension of that subject. And so I've explained before, hey, Brother Lao Tzu, I've explained before that my mind works the way Louis Armstrong's worked. In this sense, we're both born on the same birthday, August the 4th. Now, some of you don't give 2 cents about astrology. We've done a couple of shows on it. I'll just tell you that it's the best system of character analysis on the planet because it's God's system. Those planets up there aren't just physical bodies. Everything that God created that's physical or material has a spirit component. And if the human being is a spirit living, a human being, a spirit person in a physical body, then, and we're just, human beings, we're important. We've got God within us. But what do you think that bigger universe up there is like? Those are physical, material entities that have great spirit power. So I'm explaining this for 2 reasons: to stress to people the importance of astrology in terms of knowing yourself. Dr. Phil McGee, who was Dean of the College of Ethnic Studies, one of the architects of the Black psychology movement, a teacher of Dr. Wade Nobles, and a friend of Naeem Akbar. He made the comment. I was in his office one day, and Wade Nobles was with me, and he's often heard me talk about the value of astrology. And Phil McGee was a master psychologist, and his contribution to Black psychology was in the area of melanin. And he made the comment. He said, astrology is the best system of character analysis in the world. And Wade was there. And I said, say that again, Phil. So I'm explaining the way my mind works on one level astrologically. My mind works the way Louis Armstrong did. I'm not putting myself in his stratosphere. If there's an innovator of jazz, it was Louis Armstrong. There is no one, but he would come closest to being the one. A master player, composer, and a singer, even though some people would say he wasn't a great singer. Well, ask the singers, because he had that guttural, rough blues sound that African-American artists love because it's real. And so he was born on August the 4th, as I am. I'm not saying he was born on my birthday. I'm born on his. And his mind worked this way. He said every composition he did was like a chapter in a book with a beginning, middle, and ending. And that's the way my mind works if I'm giving a speech or doing an article. And of course, I write books. And so the presentations on this show are like chapters in a book with a beginning, middle, and ending, but they are also real chapters that hook up. And I'm planning to take a number of these shows and put them in book form eventually. I have binders full of these shows, so that it can be out there on another level. Because while this internet is good, YouTube, Instagram, and all of them, Facebook, you don't know how long it's going to be here. And then you don't know how long you'll be on these platforms. And so I've taken various fail-safe measures to protect what I have here. So when I do a show, and I might improvise and come up with a topic in the beginning, I'm working out of something that says, yeah, I should do this. But then once I get into it, then I usually connect it. And so it's not only like chapters in a book, but it's like a series of chapters that connect. So I'm telling you this because for people who haven't been with the show since its beginning, it would be wise for you when you go back and check a show out and it's got a series, start with the first one and then go through it, because that's how I laid it out. So the reason that my mind works this way, and Louis Armstrong's did, and by the way, Barack Obama has this same birthday, is that in astrology, you have a sun sign, but then there are decatons, and every sun sign is broken into 3 decatons of 10 degrees based on when you're born, your birth date, your birth time. I'm August the 4th, so I'm in the 2nd decaton of Leo. The first decaton of Leo is Leo. The second is Sagittarius. The third is Aries. And so when you deal with each sign, it works like that. And so someone in the first decaton of a sign is going to be the pure sign. And then someone in the second deck, and so that's the first 10 degrees, which will be the first 10 days of the sign. And someone who's in the second decaton of the sign will draw on the qualities that will kind of blend with the qualities of the sign itself. So mine is Sagittarius. So when you blend Sagittarius, which is the more philosophical, spiritual sign, with Leo, which is the creative and whatnot, then once you get this blend that has a philosophical, spiritual orientation, and because of the way my sun and Jupiter work, I'm a constant reader. Malcolm X had this same astrological relationship of Sun trine Jupiter. And that made him, once he woke up, a lifelong reader after that. But he always had that inclination. And so for me, reading is like breathing, you know. The only thing I love more than reading is the truth and war, whether it's psychological or political, you know what I mean? Because I'm a warrior. But the key thing is the way this show goes is like that. And so, and the same thing with Louis Armstrong. He wasn't just a musician, he was a writer, and he had a typewriter that he carried with him. And in between shows, and when he wasn't doing a show, he was typing and writing. And he was a thinker, you know, not that you have to write to be a thinker, but this was his way of expressing his thought, along with music, especially music. So, you know, in looking at this show, it's important to understand that the various shows are connected, many of them. So, for example, one of the early shows was on the Civil War and post-Reconstruction. The subtitle was Voting Trump Out of the White House and Putting Him in the Jailhouse. It's taken a long time to come up with this documentation to stick him in the jailhouse. Hopefully that happens. So that was a look at Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction and whatnot, but it was really a focus on the election of 2020, and I was projecting how Trump would lose, and it came out that way. Go watch that show. And it's got my cinematographer, Lo Rojan, did a beautiful historical film work that backs that up. So that show connects into a number of shows on post-Reconstruction that don't follow straight away. And the January the 6th show that was done for 2021, the themes that come out of the first show help to explain some of the January 6th show on the insurrection at the Capitol. And the show that was done in January this year on the January the 6th incident, in that case, cast the analysis within the lens of post-Reconstruction. And it was a detailed analysis. So if you go and hook those up, you'll see that they flow like a seamless web. The same with a series that we did on God Within, and this is one of the most popular ones, where I'm looking at one show focused on the Ka, which is your destiny, because these shows are about getting people to realize the powers of God that reside within us. And so the Ka is your destiny. And so we went into the Kemetic idea of destiny, Yoruba, Asante, Igbo concepts of destiny. And African spirit systems are both abstract, deep, and practical. And so you get a lot out of it. And so then another one, another show that followed was on SIA, SIA, exceptional intellectual clarity. And that's the higher mind. And I've had that experience. It's the higher mind. It's the God within. If you work real hard and you don't have answers to certain questions, if God intervenes and gives you the answer, I call it is the within anything, everything. You get the whole of an answer to something, and you will only be able to realize the part that you understand. So my book, Return to the African Mother Principle, of male and female equality, comes from the light, and it's the only book to identify our family model. I didn't invent that. I discovered it. I'm the only scholar in the world that's discovered it. This book's considered a classic. Or my analysis on what's hit Black communities since '68. What's the effect of that? A choice between two cultures? That comes from God. Those words, those aren't mine. And I've done some shows, one with James Smalls, where, we look at what's the effect of the hits that our community faced since '68. And God told me it's a choice between two cultures. And when you play it out, you'll see that. And people who understand that have read the book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. These are professors, community organizers, everyday people. They all say the same thing. It's a choice between two cultures. Because if you pipe into SIA, God's mind ain't no holes in it. It's only the holes with you. So any mistakes I make in interpreting it, that's my fault. But God ain't making no mistakes. So those shows, SIA, exceptional intellectual clarity, and then Hati, which is your heart, which means heart-mind. And so this is the African, in this case, Kemetic concept of how intuition and reason connect in the heart-mind. And I showed in that particular show how the Japanese and Chinese have the same term. They don't call it Hati, they call it heart-mind in their language. And so how could different cultures come up with the same conclusion? Well, Blacks were at their foundation, but also anyone that's into deep exploration into the spirit, into the soul of people will find that. And spiritual civilizations or spirit-based civilizations will. Then I had a series of shows on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. It was a series. It didn't look like it when it started out, but that's what it's become. The first one in 2021, with Professor Menu Ampin. The authority on this subject was entitled The Revolutionary Martin Luther King. The second one with Menu Ampin the same year, 2021, was the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And then last month, those of you that watched this, we had a conversation with Menu Ampim on the real Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And this surveyed his overall contributions. So if you look at them thematically, you'll get something out of it. And I really want to stress that when I bring on scholars, they're the best. And Menu Ampin is the best on King, particularly his revolutionary orientation, because a lot of people have covered his life and his campaigns, but they've deliberately left out his revolutionary orientation because they're writing for major publishing houses. And they don't want to hear that. And plus, some of them probably don't either. Taylor Branch and others, they get Pulitzer Prizes for telling you a lot of stuff that's already known and then distorting King's legacy, but not dealing with the real Martin Luther King, which is the revolutionary Martin Luther King. And then again, the linkage, the last two shows have been on Black Power, one on Garvey and the Ghanaian independence movement, and the other on the 60s. And each one bringing you some stuff that you may not have known. And particularly the one on the 60s was from the perspective of my own participation and the perspective of people like Kwame Ture, then known Stokely Carmichael, Willie Ricks, and others. So this is not only scholarly, but an activist point of view. So that's what I want to really say about this show is it's like chapters in a book. I'm doing my best because I'm leaving this for our people, and I want to leave my best. And as I said, a lot of these are going to be packaged into books, and I have binders full of these shows. I have them here. I'm not going to pick them up, but they're thick binders with this. Now, today's show is going to be in many ways a continuation of the Black Power shows with an emphasis on white power and the white power movement. And it's going to look at how it's been affected by the white power movement has been affected by the Black Power movement. In fact, the very use of the term white power by whites was they're copying our term Black Power because it reflected a defeatist mentality. As you'll see, they suffered defeats at our hands in the 60s. And so they were using some of our tools to Americanize their reality, but in a way very different from ours. So white power, you know what I mean? They weren't talking about that until they heard Black power, but you don't have any power. You know, I'm joking, but we always say, we're powerless. We don't have any power. Woe is me. Well, if that's the way you think, that's the way you are. But you actually got quite a powerful people here. And our biggest power is our creativity and our humanity. Those are powers in and of themselves. So today's show is going to, again, when it looks at white power, put it in within the context of the second post-Reconstruction that started in '68. And that's really how these movements that developed from the 70s on, especially with the new right wing, they developed from our standpoint within that context, and they behave pretty much the way post-Reconstruction says things are going to behave. So you always need to know what time it is for history. As John Henry Clark would say, history's like a clock. Yeah, and it's cyclical. But before getting in today's show, I started introducing a series on the last 2 weeks on topical news. And I will continue that. But for this week, I want to do something different. And it's because I was looking at one of the Facebook sins coming from one of our real conscious viewers, a brother named Kamari Dreamchild Renzori. And he sends out a lot of conscious material, a lot of it reading lists, and then his beautiful conscious wife, Kim Lady X Mosley. This is a real conscious family. They got them a daughter, a granddaughter, and they're serious readers and they're activists. And so I was in between preparing for this show, and I clicked into one of his sends that he had sent on Facebook, and he sent out a number of books. So I thought that it would be useful to share some of these books with you. And if you take notes, write them down, but otherwise we'll post them underneath this show. I'll put up a thing where I actually post these books. And he sent out a list of many more, but I picked out a few that I thought were important. And a few of them apply directly to the topic of this show. One book is called The Kaiser's Holocaust. It deals with German genocide of Africans in Southwest Africa that is generally unknown. It's again called The Kaiser's Holocaust. And the book is also showing how the genocide carried out against Africans in Southwest Africa prepared the fuel for the genocide that Hitler carried out. But that's only one of the things that prepared the fuel for him. We'll go into that one today. The author of this book is David Olusoga, and there's another author as well. I just listed one. Another book that he recommended, which is on the brother you see behind me with the sunglasses, Amilcar Cabral, is entitled "The Life of a Reluctant Nationalist" by Antonio Thomas. This is one I haven't read. I've read just about everything on Cabral. And one reason I'm citing these books is he cited books I haven't read. I mean, a lot of them. And so when this show's over, I'm ordering them and reading them. That's what I enjoy about the show is you got people at different levels of consciousness and you learn from them. That's what I look forward to, including your comments here, both comments as well as questions. And whatever other comments you leave below the page or through sending me something through my own contact. Another book is called Full Spectrum Dominance. And this is dealing with American military strategies. And a whole lot of this brother's books have to deal with this, which says a lot about his orientation. Another one is called Murder Incorporated by Mumia Abu Jamal. And this is a brother who's serving a life sentence as a member of the Black Panther Party and the MOVE organization, who's been framed and whose health has deteriorated tremendously. And there's a worldwide movement to free him. And you should support that. Another book is entitled Dirty Work, The CIA in Africa by Ellen Ray and others. I only list one author. There are other authors. And this one applies directly to this show today. You'll see that this will be addressed today. Hitler's American Model by James Whitman. Another one is entitled Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. I'll also be discussing that today in a different context, by Anthony Sutton. Another one pertinent to African-American history is entitled Slave Patrols, Law and Violence by Sally Hayden. And many Black people see the police as serving as modern day slave patrollers, and these vigilantes that they have now that we'll be talking about under the new right wing as an extension of that as well. The last two books directly pertain to this show and deal with one of the people that I'll be dealing with in this show that's on the leaflet, the one in black and white, Smedley Butler, 3-star Marine Corps general. And I actually hadn't seen these books. Smedley Butler had been a 3-star Marine Corps general, head of the Marine Corps at one point, and two-time Congressional Medal of Honor winner, which is very rare, probably in the history of the military. There've been only a handful of people to get two. And what he cites here is two books, one by Smedley Butler and another on Smedley Butler. One is called War is a Racket by General Smedley Butler. Now, if you saw the show that I did with James Smalls on the forces that have hit the Black community since '68, I preceded that with a poem entitled America the Pimp, and that was done by a brother who teaches in our school, the African Children's Advanced Learning Center, Pan-African People Organization School. I chair that organization, but leaders in the organization have kept this school going for 50 years. And so the teacher in the school is a master poet. And so he did a poem called America the Pimp by a brother named Lodge Daly. The brother who did the poem is Robert Woods, a master poet, and got a poet's voice and a poet's look. Bad, you know. But when he finished, or actually before he did his poem, I quoted Smedley Butler. And basically, the title of his book, War is a Racket, basically, I quoted him. What I wanted to do was because this had been filmed before for that show, what I wanted to do was do a film clip where he actually speaks himself, but I didn't have copyright authorization. So instead, I read it. And basically what he said was he was a criminal for organized crime, and he worked for the banking syndicate. And then he talked about how he could teach Al Capone some lessons because Al Capone operated in only a couple of cities. And he said he operated on 3 continents, enforcing organized crime, which is the military being used to enforce the decisions of the bankers, who he called racketeers in this book. So you're going to hear more about him in this show. And since in my brainwash days, I was in the Marine Reserves, and by the way, it's common. I've talked to a number of people who are in the regulars who went through boot camp, and their boot camp trainers tell them, we are basically participating in a racket. We protect big business. Not all of them tell them that, but I think the conscious ones do. And I have a couple of friends that have told me that. So this isn't just Smedley Butler talking. And I was brainwashed when I entered it because I had been watching James, various movies on the Marines and John Wayne and movies like that. And so it was my awakening that led me to realize I had no business in here. But by that time, I had cashiered out 6 years, honorably discharged, free of any draft in Vietnam, and with a few skills that I didn't really need, but it was okay. You know what I mean? So I want to thank Brother Kamari Dreamchild Ren Zori for these books. And there's also another book about him, and the Marines. It's called The Marines and the Making and Breaking of America's Empire. That's important because the military industrial complex or the national security state is the main reason why America is going down the tubes. All the wars it's lost, all the money it's put into guns when it should have put it into the people, it's bringing America down. So that's that. So reading is important. If you're going to lead a rewarding life, you need to read good stuff, you know. So the topic for today is, I think, a timely one that can help you understand how to defeat the forces that are arraigned against us. Forces designed to smash what's called democracy, which is the voting system. Technically, this is a republic. This is not a democracy. But the act of voting and whose votes get counted, which Trump has done a lot in his minions to distort and select out. This is a process of removing a body of people, black and brown and young whites, from the voting rolls. And that's something that a lot of whites may think doesn't affect them, except maybe some young whites, because it's aimed at blacks. Well, we're the balance of power in these elections. So if you take us out of the equation, then the person that you might, because if you are, let's say you're white and you're a third of the vote that comes for the Democratic Party, your vote will get canceled because the balance of power vote, which is the black vote, is out of the picture in the sense that it's been weakened. And the same thing with the Latino vote. So, and people of color vote. So this threat to blacks isn't just a threat to blacks, it's a threat to the electoral system. And one that is designed to put as one of my friends said of her white friend who described Trump as King Trump and then closed her mouth. She didn't mean to say it in her presence. Put him back on his throne. And if he could, he'd stay there until he croaked on a hamburger or something. You know what I'm talking about? So today's show is about empowering you with information so that you have more to use when you're engaged in empowering yourself, your family, and your community. And so the topic for today's show is comparing Trump and the right-wing attempt to smash democracy with the 1934 attempt to overthrow the US government. And the whole purpose of this is to enable you to have more information to prevent what they're trying to do from happening. Not just putting Trump in the White House, but empowering at a higher level right-wing forces. And so first rule in war is know yourself, and the second one is know your enemy. And what I'm going to present today, some of it is background information on what has made Trump what he is, or provided Trump with a perspective that has enabled him to appeal to a broad mass base of whites, so that you understand how this new right wing has impacted him, and in turn understand how it's impacted the larger country. And I'll be tying that into a little known attempt to overthrow the US government in 1934. And this is something that very few people know about. And that's part of what this show's designed to do, is to bring you stuff that you need to know that you might not be able to find out otherwise. So the topic for today's show is addressing how Trump stopped the steal lie-in movement has led to legislation designed to restrict the black, brown, and youth vote to smash the U.S. electoral system by empowering whites who will, gain greater power in elections when the black and brown and white youth vote are reduced. And so this is really the point. What Trump couldn't achieve in his attack in January the 6th, 2021, he's now moving to achieve through legal means, making what's illegal legal by stripping us of the vote. And of course, fellow Congress people in the Republican Party are doing the same thing through gerrymandering at the local, state, and federal level. And this is designed to keep a people whose numbers are going down in power for as long as possible politically. Because of the nature of the historical time we're living through, long term, this can't work. Long term, as the numbers shift in this country, that's a part of a power shift. It's not the whole, it's not the economic, it's not the military, but it is a part of what can become a political power shift that will translate into other power shifts, including a cultural power shift, and ultimately a power shift economically, something we have to be working on right now. So if you know the nature of these forces, then you have a chance to better figure out how to handle them. If you don't, you might be overwhelmed by them or take them for granted. And you shouldn't, because the handwriting is on the wall and it should be clear. Now, to understand Trump and his supporters' strategies involving electoral rigging, gerrymandering, which is creating electoral maps at the local, state, and national level that determines office holders, that is, Republicans or Democratic office holders. And in doing that, it helps to determine who gets more representation, whites, blacks, brown, red, or yellow. And we, a couple of weeks ago, talked about how Trump did his best to manipulate the census so that he could downplay the black and particularly the brown vote count by wiping out of the census count people who were not citizens, which are always counted in a census count. And that was so that he could then proportionally up the white count and reduce the brown and black count. Because the immigrants that are in this country aren't all brown, though more so, you also have blacks and Asian people. And the Asian influx in this country is large, very little of it illegal, by their standards. But the point is that was a part of that measure to prop up white power, even though it's in decline. So when we look at these different measures that are being used, we need to put them in the context of the historical period. What time is it? And we need to be looking at, when we measure the historical time and determine it, we need to be looking at, so which group of the power groupings in this country does this historical period favor? And you can usually determine that by who's winning and who's losing. In this case, we're talking politically. So when you take this measure, you'll also be able to see who's on the offense and who's on the defense, because we too often think defensively. Woe is me. And so we'll discount victories. And so when we have victories, we don't chalk them up. And you should never just jump up and brag and you just run around pounding your chest, but you should note when you've won and when you've lost. And when you've lost, assess why, so it doesn't happen again. But we've had a lot of victories, but you think talking to a lot of Black people, we're just defeated, And so we're not really, dealing with reality. For example, right now, last week, I had a comment from a brother based on what I said last week about how our power put Biden in the White House and how it pushed him to pick a Black female vice president, and it pushed him to decide to say that he would pick a Black female justice to the Supreme Court, something that's never been done before. And then somebody said, and I'm assuming they were Black based on the comment, well, that's not revolutionary. I never said it was. Since when have you had a revolutionary on the Supreme Court? Look at among all the African-centered scholars, I'm the only one that's a revolutionary among the major ones. That's according to Theophilo Obenga, and I happen to know that's a fact. Now, there's some you don't know so well, some of them. There are few, but very few. So if I know there's very few revolutionaries among the African-centered scholars, don't you think I know that Biden ain't going to be picking no revolutionary for the Supreme Court? It's one of the most reactionary institutions you have. I mean, if we were waiting on the Supreme Court to end slavery, we'd still be picking cotton. Took an executive order and then amendments to the Constitution, and they've been working to undermine those, undermining voting rights. Chief Justice Roberts with his smart Federalist Society self. You know what I mean? But the key point is now, when you look at it, a huge number of Biden's federal judge appointments have been Black women. Black women. You know what I mean? Now you're going to say, what kind? Yeah, you're going to scrutinize them. Ain't none of them revolutionary. But some of them have some very interesting profiles, But the key point is it comes from your power. And please believe me, that upsets the right wing. What makes them sad should make you glad, but I don't go on reaction. I'm happy because of the facts, not someone's reaction. But for those that want to go on that standard, well, that's a good measure too, So I've noted in past shows that the historical period of the 50s and the 60s was the period of the second, of the 50s and 60s was the second Reconstruction. And this was the period where, along with our victory in the Civil War, and Blacks with a balance of power, 170,000 Blacks made the difference in the outcome of the Civil War. We won the Civil War. Without us, Union would have lost. And of course, a lot of us might still be picking cotton. You know what I mean? But when you gave brothers a trusty rifle, they started blowing away slave masters at great speed. And I pointed out in that show that a white Southerner made the comment. It wasn't until the Negroes got involved in the struggle that we started losing. You're darn right. We're the baddest warriors on the planet, and we had the most incentive to blow your behinds away. You know what I mean? Huh? So the first victory we chalked up was winning the Civil War. And then the second, third, and fourth was voting rights, desegregation, and the spillover from the Black freedom and Black power movement, particularly Black freedom movement at that point, was the immigration law of 1965. It was spillover. We didn't actually push for that, but we created the climate out of which people like Lyndon Johnson, who weren't exactly humanists, we're trying to present an image to the world that America ain't all bad. And so one of the things they did is say, well, yeah, let some people of color into this country. They never imagined that they'd come flooding in. Huh? That's what you call unintended consequences. So that is also a victory. And that is, of course, one of the main things that good old Trump don't like. The right wing don't like, because it's displacing them. And again, because we're always on the defensive. We'll say, yeah, but that ain't real power. The white people will control the economy. They'll control the military. They'll control blah, 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 blah. Yeah, but how did they get control of this? Numbers. Native Americans kept seeing more and more whites coming into this country. And then, of course, gunpowder. But it was numbers. And if you're going to shift power, it starts on the numerical level. And so this shift, this demographic shift, is a reflection of that. And it is the result of this Black freedom movement, and an unintended consequence. We didn't actually plan that. There's a lot of unintended things you do that turn out you can take credit for. Like when I led the San Francisco freedom movement, I wasn't intending to radicalize whites when I got them involved. And the high peak of the movement, 10,000 people with students playing an important role, I didn't plan to give birth to a free speech movement. That's what happened. You know what I mean? As they say, shit happens. And then it taught me a lesson. Oh, Black people are strategic in this country. As we move, other people move. Oh, that's power, baby. The right wing ain't figured that one out yet. You know what I mean? They can listen to the show and they won't believe it. There ain't no way in the world we who are designated as inferior people could do this kind of stuff. Keep on underestimating us. I wish you didn't, because I'd rather whip you, fair and square. But if you want to go and underestimate, that's the first rule in war: not to break, not to know your enemy. So go right ahead, So this is the 60s was the time of the second Reconstruction, and it restored rights lost during the first post-Reconstruction. And I've always made the point, there is a distinction in these two periods of the 1865, 66 period, 1876 period, the 1955, which is the beginning of the second Reconstruction, and the 1968 period. The big distinction is this: America was on its rise during the Civil War, post-Civil War period, and America's in decline now. Declining as a world power, declining numerically, and soon, the population shift is going to reflect that, as California does now. So you're in a different historical period, and this historical period favors you, even though there are great forces lined against you. It's a question of how you use those favorable forces to your advantage. So when we look at Trump and his political moves, we must examine the right wing, which is his hardcore base. Not all of the people who support him are right wing. A lot of them are racist, but not necessarily right wing. These are coming out of hardcore, the right wing, more than conservative groups. Ku Klux Klan, paramilitary groups, Proud Boys, and others. These are the new right wing, and others that I'm going to talk about here. And so to understand this period is to understand how this period affects them as well as how it affects us. This is the period where whites of various stripes moved to take back gains that we made in the Reconstruction periods. In this case, the 55 and 60s periods. This is the period where that happens. But this is also the period, the post-Reconstruction periods, where the consciousness of Black people reaches its highest point. And with that high level of consciousness comes a lot of change and transformation. So we need to understand that the right wing in this country, especially, is caught up in this particular cycle, a period of decline where they have suffered defeats at our hands politically, and it's mirrored in their writings, their organizing, their leadership, and in their philosophy. Now, one of the things that's real key to understand, when we're dealing with the right or even the masses of whites, particularly those who are on the reactionary side, you got to understand all whites ain't in the same position. And that's another mistake that we often make. If you've not been involved in struggle, we just lump them all together, say we're alone, and then act like that. In struggle, you lead your own forces, organize your own group. But under certain circumstances, it's in your interest to form alliances and coalitions. That's how Trump was defeated. And that's what King did. That's part of what contributed to his success. But his major success was the unity that he had among Black folks. And in the San Francisco Freedom Movement was the same thing. There were times where a coalition, which is a temporary arrangement between groups, was necessary. And then there were times where a long-term arrangement, which you call alliance, was necessary. And then there were times where we could do it on our own. If you can do it on your own, don't form alliances and coalitions. But if you can't do it on your own, then form them under circumstances in which you control the direction. That's basically what Black Lives Matter did. Not all intended either, because when George Floyd is murdered, you have this massive upsurge and you have every kind of ethnic group in the streets. And Black Lives Matter was the best organized of these groups, so it could kind of, channel things, at least with slogans and statements and stuff like that. But the point is, Blacks were leading that. Outflanked Trump and put him not only in the doghouse, but ready for the jailhouse. And we hope that happens, but I wouldn't count on it. Be nice if it happens, but I wouldn't count on it because they're moving slow as mud. You know what I mean? I wonder why. So if we're going to understand this historical period, we need to understand how European philosophy, which derives from Aryan philosophy, affects how the hard right sees things, the right wing, and then in general, how a lot of whites see things, and some of us who've been infected by this thinking. So don't think that this just applies to whites. And this, by the way, is why the sixfold stages to mental freedom is so important. To free your mind from any kind of mental incarceration that you may face from the brainwashing we get in this society. I know because I've gone through it and I'm working on myself. So I pointed out in some previous shows that when you talk about whites, it's really appropriate to define them as Aryans because that's their root. European is a recent term that comes after the fall of the Roman Empire. But Aryan is the root word that defines the people. And this is referring to both Indo-Aryans that sweep out of the Caucasus Mountains into India and conquer it, or the Western Aryans, or the Eastern European Aryans, which make up the largest group among the Europeans, and the one that the Western Europeans don't like the Russians. Part of what you're seeing on Russia today, the anti-Russian stuff has got to do with this split among Western and Eastern Europeans. And the Russians are considered to be below their standards, but also Western Europeans have opposed Russia because of the Russian Revolution, a whole bunch of other things. But here's the key thing. When you're going to understand the Aryan and how they view the world, then you have to understand what Aryans mean. I'm only going to go into one part here. I've gone into both parts before, but it's only one part that's relevant for this discussion. Aryan means lords and masters. Their view of their relationship to the rest of the world is that they should be in charge, lord and masters. That's also their view of their relationship to nature. And I have a show where I went into this in fair detail, and you should watch it. But that is the essence of them. Now, this is not to be confused with just the narrow Hitler definition, because a lot of people want to reject this because, oh, you're talking about Hitler and he was a madman. Well, we'll see just how mad. But the point is, this precedes Hitler. And in fact, he's identifying with his own group, but he's bringing it into a very savage and barbaric level, which a lot of them have practiced, because basically the Aryan went around the world genociding people, in case you didn't notice. So this idea of Aryan being lord and masters means that they think they should be in a position of total dominance of other people across the globe. And this notion of total dominance or lord and master is reflected best in the thought of Greece's first philosopher, Hesiod. And Hesiod was a sheep herder, a poet, and he couldn't read or write. But what he enunciated were the thoughts of the masses of the Aryans who were Greeks, but pretty much summarized the Aryan worldview in his notion of power and freedom, and they're both the same for them. And so their notion of power and their notion of freedom is that it's arbitrary, meaning those who are lords and masters, and by the way, lords and masters, you may think means all white people. No, it refers to the Arius that rules the Aryans. The Arius are the masters. The Aryans are the masses of whites who do the bidding of their masters. And so the Arius, the leading Aryans, originally were warriors. And their view was that their people were no good for nothing, dirty scum. And then their view, that's whites, and then their view of people of color was less than that. And when you combine that with racism, they put into a category of being subhuman. So Hesiod, when he talks about the meaning of freedom and power to the Aryan, and it is the gut meaning, you can go all you want through the Constitution and get all of this justice and equality stuff, but check their practice. And it pretty much accords to Hesiod's definition. And what is it? That freedom and power is exercised arbitrarily. In other words, those who have the power do whatever they want to do. I recall a discussion where Europeans were asking, why did the Germans do what they did to the Jews? And the ultimate answer was because they could. In other words, Jews were hated all over Europe. But it was Hitler that decided to, erect the gas ovens. Before that, shoot them, but that wasn't efficient, so they create gas ovens. But the key point is, his decision was arbitrary, but it was, of course, based on hatred. But that is the Aryan conception of power. It's got nothing to do with ethics, justice, or truth. And so when King was talking about we didn't know how to exercise power or build power, and I was talking about that's basically true, he also, even though he saw how savage the Western system was, and we would say is, and he identified the system that governs their exercise of power today as capitalism, as a bad system that oppresses people. I don't know if he fully got the fact that freedom in the Aryan sense has got nothing to do with anything called truth or justice. It's just naked, brutal exercise of power, any way those who are powerful decide to exercise it. And if you look at Greek history and European history, that's pretty much how it's gone. And that's also been the key to their fall. 2 world wars brought Europe to an end as a world power, particularly Britain, sealed its fate by them having bloody wars against each other. So that's also been the weakness in their exercise of this power. So as long as whites have absolute power, and of course their ruling groups do, but the masses of whites who identify with it, even though they're not the ones who are in control of the power, they feel better. But because they're in a particular kind of mentality that I'm going to go into in a minute, if they lose any of it, they feel dispossessed. Now, you would say, how can you say whites are dispossessed when they still control not the masses of whites, but the elite in this country, the levels of power, political, economic, military, science, and whatnot? It's because of this idea of power being absolute, exercised arbitrarily, that they have this right to be lords and masters, that when any part of it is weakened, then they feel like they've lost it. And so there is a feeling among the right wing, particularly the new right, but the right wing, and among a large sector of whites, that they're being dispossessed. And it's because they don't have full spectrum dominance. That book that was cited by one of our viewers, that they can have this feeling of dispossession. And this is the attitude of Trump in particular, a large number of whites in this country. The other aspect of the Aryan mindset, or white mindset, as it's called today, is the dichotomized mind, or the either or mind, that sees things as either good or bad, black or white, right or wrong. This comes from Plato. And Plato creates this dichotomized or either or kind of thinking. And so again, if it's either that whites have the power or they don't, you know what I mean? Well, actually, everything is a mixture. In good, there's bad. In positive, there's negative. They don't think that way. When you think that way, you have a better chance of skinning the cat than thinking in absolute terms. So to understand Trump and the hardcore forces that support him, and then the mass base, which is much larger, Trump has brought in a large mass base, you have to understand then the new right that developed during the 1974 to 1986 period. This new right occurs during the period of post-Reconstruction, the second post-Reconstruction. It's a period where the white power elite and the masses of whites, largely, though not all, are in support of taking back the gains from blacks gained in the 60s. And so you have people like Bill Maher. I was watching his show. He claims to be on our side. He's already said, I mentioned this last week, he's got $140 million for telling jokes. And he's smart. He claims to be progressive. And he's already said he don't think whites should pay reparations. He got $140 million. He got it off the backs of this system that was built on free labor and genocide and stealing half of Mexico. But he shouldn't pay anything for that. And then I was watching a show earlier this week where he had some brother on, and he was saying, well, you know, I've been looking at these polls on affirmative action, and it looks like blacks don't even support it. Maybe it's time to end it. You understand? Beware of the liberal. I'm going to be talking about the hardcore right wing, but as Dick Gregory said, he said, a liberal someone that'll hang you from a low tree, and a conservative somebody that'll hang you from a high tree. So it looks like Bill Maher, who's supposed to be this liberal, is constantly shedding all the things that he's for. his comfort level with his $140 billion has made him even more conservative. And I won't say where his head's at on whether he likes black people or not. But the key point is, um, what's the difference between him and a whole lot of right wing people? And we got blacks who will say, yeah, we don't need that affirmative action. I see blacks who go to Ivy League colleges say, I felt inferior because they say I came here under affirmative action. Don't you understand that genocide was affirmative action? Don't you understand that stealing the land of Native Americans was affirmative action? Don't you understand over 400 years of free black labor was affirmative action? Stealing Mexico, the northern half, was affirmative action. It put whites in a privileged position where they could come from other countries, step over you, and do better than you. You understand? That's affirmative action. So if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, you know? So I don't care what any poll says, you know? The problem with affirmative action is it ain't worked too well for us. White women have benefited much better off of affirmative action than we have, and people of color have, you know? And by the way, that was one of the gains of the 60s, affirmative action. It came from demands from the street and from conservative organizations like the Urban League. Whitney Young was calling for that, you know? So if we're going to understand Trump's moves around smashing the electoral process to favor whites, and if we're going to understand a move that a lot of you haven't heard about, which is the effort to overthrow this country in 1934, then we need to understand the new right wing that develops beginning in the 70s during this onset of the second post-Reconstruction. And we need to understand the central thought of one person that really helps to shape the outlook of this new right wing. And rarely are you able to say that. And I really want to say this. Usually, you know, when you're thinking about how people are influenced politically, you don't think of a novel as having a political influence, even though people like to be told stories. But if you look at Lenin, who led the Russian Revolution, he was heavily influenced, of course, by the thoughts of Marx. He was a Marxist, but he was heavily influenced by a novel, What's to Be Done? And that became the heading for his strategies and tactics for seizing the Russian government after really others had made the first move. Leon Trotsky had made the first move and then turned over the power that he had gained when he overthrew a government called the Kerensky government that had taken the place of the Tsar that had been ruling ruthlessly over Russia for a long time. So a novel had some influence on Lenin, big influence. And so a novel would have a big influence on the right wing. And so you're going to say, oh, really? You know what I mean? Our novelists usually tell beautiful stories like Toni Morrison, or Ellison, Richard Wright, or a host of others. So how could a novel have this influence? Well, first, it's to understand the authors, a guy named William Luther Pierce, Pierce, William Luther Pierce. This was, and this is true of a number of the right-wing leaders, not all of them, but some of them are very smart. And in this particular case, William Luther Pierce was a graduate with a graduate degree from the California Institute of Technology. And then he gained a PhD in physics from the University of Boulder in Colorado, at Boulder in 1962. He marries a woman who's a mathematician and who also teaches at a university at that time. She later left him, and she never adopted his philosophy. But Pierce, after 30 years of age, starts to get political, and he joins the American Nazi Party in 1966. But he only joins when it becomes Americanized, because one of Pierce's real contributions is the way in which he Americanizes right-wing thought, particularly thought coming out of Europe, in this case, Nazi thought, but also he influences people who Americanize KKK, Ku Klux Klan thought. And then he influences paramilitary groups that come along after him, okay? At least after the publication of his book. So it's when Lincoln Rockwell, who was himself an Ivy League college graduate, who headed the American Nazi Party and who goose-stepped and wore a swastika and imitated Hitler, that was something that Pierce thought was funny because he's looking at it from the American perspective. I mean, you know, America's got its own fascism, man. Why don't you hook up with your own tradition? It's around whiteness. And it's when Rockwell changes the name of his party from the American Nazi Party to the National Socialist White People's Party. Now, National Socialist is the term that Hitler used for his party. But White People's Party, that really comes out of the whole way in which Europeans were assimilated into Americanism by making them white. Once he sees that, he joins the party because he thinks, well, now they're getting serious. Whites in this country are going to listen to him. Now, Pierce agreed with the philosophy of the Nazis. He just didn't like the package. He also is coming of a period, and he's of the mindset where he's going to shape an interpretation of white racism and of the new white right-wing politics that defines what they're experiencing in this country right now, or at least their interpretation of it. So Pierce's major contribution is that he Americanizes right-wing thought, whether it comes from Europe or anywhere else, it's Americanized. And so Pierce's contribution to the new right wing, which is also the hardcore base of Trump, is through Pierce's view of the state of whites in the United States, a view that reflects the thinking of a large sector of whites in this country, not because of his book, but because his book addresses sentiments held by a lot of people in this country. Before getting into those views, you should note that over 20 years, Pierce's book that I'm going to talk about in a minute sold over 500,000 copies. Now, you'd say that's not a lot if you're talking about bestseller numbers, and especially over 20 years. But it's a lot if you're talking about 500,000 books being sold to right-wingers, white nationalists, who find out about the book that he wrote in gun clubs by reading mercenary soldier fortune magazines and belonging to the Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, and what would emerge after the writing of this book, and I'm not saying he's the sole reason for that, paramilitary groups. And these would represent the foot soldiers in this new right. But also, you would have another wing of the new right, which is the political mainstream wing of the new right. And that's the reality that you have today. You got the paramilitary, you got the mainstream, those that run for office or those who try and influence people who are voting. And what's interesting is now their views are very close. And some are in both camps, some who are in elected office, a few in the House of Representatives are members of these groups. So there's been a merger, but for the majority who are not members of the groups, their positions are virtually identical. And this new right has helped shift the Republicans rightward and has impacted the Democratic Party as well. I'll deal with that later. So what's the book that Pierce puts out that's such an influence on the new right and becomes an influence on politicians like Trump and to a degree Ronald Reagan and to some degree Bill Clinton and some other Democrats as well, but mainly on the right. The name of the book is The Turner Diaries. Now, what's important about this book is to note the atmosphere in which the book is cast. The position of whites who are defined as beleaguered heroes, and the issues that they're addressing. Basically, the book tells this story, and then I'll identify the meaning of that, and some of you will pick it up without me telling you, you know. First of all, the book is written in the 70s. So this is the beginning of the post-Reconstruction era, but it is the period in which the right wing shook up by the defeats that they faced at the hands of the Black Freedom Movement, and symbolically, because this was the slogan, at the hands of the Black Power movement. And I'm sure the symbols of a Black Panther parading around with guns and stuff, and then radical blacks and whites taking a stand against the war in Vietnam and all this stuff, they are on a period of a psychological and political defensiveness. And so this book, this novel, is a story of dispossession. Basically, the Turner Diaries reflect a mentality of dispossession, meaning dispossession of power, something that's central to Trump. I made the point a couple of weeks ago, my wife had told me about this because she reads all this stuff, that Trump would hire a Black person to imitate Obama in his office. This is before he ran for president, and fire him every day. You know what I mean? And then, of course, when Obama did that press club joker fest on Trump that was masterful. I mean, I'm sure he had some good comedians that wrote the lines, but he delivered them masterfully. That was as embarrassing as it could get. You want to talk about somebody who has an infantile, childlike personality, being publicly humiliated like that, that must have drove him right under the table, you know? So the Turner Diaries are written with this kind of concept. And I should point out, Turner didn't really get interested in the right wing until it got linked to blacks and Jews. Once those two come up, that's what interests him, because that's what he's against. You know what I mean? So the Turner Diaries is basically a story about a multicultural government. Listen to this. That enacts what's called the Cohen gun laws to restrict the rights of whites to have guns, as if you could constrict those rights. Whites got more guns in this country than all the civilians in China have, and they got 1,400,000,000 people. It's the most highly armed country on the planet. You hear me? So who's restricting your gun ownership? It's ours that's been restricted. You know what I mean? So this is a novel that's telling you about whites who are being ruled by a multicultural United States government that's oppressing the masses through restricting their rights to own guns. And it is then a story about how a small group of whites, because this is how dispossessed they feel, that they feel isolated, that their heroes don't have a large following. And the heroes who are coming out of a body called the organization decides to strike back for their liberation through uncoordinated guerrilla warfare attacks designed to weaken the federal government. These attacks include attacks on unprepared blacks and Jews. By the way, this is happening, Jewish synagogues being attacked, blacks, having their churches invaded and shot on the street, and sometimes hung, and they'll say they committed suicide. You know what I mean? This ain't like just in a book. And also, these, what he considers to be white freedom fighters, actually white nationalist racists, blow up an FBI headquarters, and they also kill a Washington Post editorial writer. So they're also telling you that they see the multicultural government as orchestrating the attacks on them through their police agencies, which they strike back at. Over time, according to the Turner Diaries, these small guerrilla units began to increase in size. Because of his defensiveness, they're always fighting out of small white enclaves, because Turner's view was that you needed to start with a small elite group of whites before you expand beyond that. And so over time, this organization gains control of Southern California, drives blacks and Latinos into the desert. And then the organization, which is this paramilitary organization, imposes a dictatorship over the areas where whites live while defeating the multicultural white military forces. This is, of course, the Great Dream, which, by the way, the military forces are multi-ethnic, 40% black and people of color. Note that. And the other thing to note, and each thing I'm saying has meaning, because I'm going to show you how each one of these things actually are playing out in real life. This ain't just a novel. And what also happens is the so-called freedom fighters, these lonely vigilantes, armed militia, what they do is hang the race traitors. These are whites who get hung. You understand? Because they got a quarrel against anyone that ain't fully, totally committed to the mighty white race. And that includes corporate heads who just care about money but don't care about the race. So they don't seem to have a very worked out economic agenda that would actually benefit white people. Their main benefit seems to be what they see as the ultimate victory of whites in Europe, and then the genocide of all blacks and people of color. So what does the multicultural government have to do with real life situation? The multicultural government of his time, Pierce's time, would be the government of Lyndon Baines Johnson. He calls it a multicultural government. It is not a multicultural government, because the government is based on the culture of Europeans or Aryans. And so if you're going to look at the political culture, it's John Locke. If you're going to look at the economic culture, it's Adam Smith. If you're going to look at the scientific culture, empirical science, it's Francis Bacon. If you're going to look at the war culture, it's Clausewitz on war. These are all people coming out of the European heritage. If you're going to look at the legal culture, it's the culture of British common law that runs this country, and where you get just ice most of the time, and where you were considered property. We all were for a long time, So to call this the multicultural government is actually quite inaccurate. But what he is saying is you got blacks in the government and you got concessions being made to blacks. And so he calls this the multicultural government. And so this would start with Lyndon Johnson, but then the paramilitary groups, the right wing, and a large sector of whites would include in that subsequent governments. particularly those of Carter, Clinton, Obama, particularly those, and now Biden. But in certain elements of Nixon and certain elements of Reagan, because there were aspects of Reagan they didn't like, but Reagan basically followed their agenda and their line. So Johnson is considered to be the head of this sellout of white power, because this country was set up, in their view, and correctly so, it was set up for whites. It wasn't set up for anybody else. And so the inclusion of blacks at any level is considered betrayal. And he calls it the multicultural United States government. So what are the concessions Johnson makes? He appoints the first black to the Supreme Court, the black that was responsible for, along with Chief Justice Marshall's decision to outlaw segregation in the schools. It's very slow to implement, but that is a no for the right wing and a whole lot of whites in this country. Busing battles would be fought later, that the new right would join in. And a lot of blacks oppose busing as well. But the fact is, for whites, it's for one reason: they don't want any blacks in their schools, period. So that's seen as a sellout. You know what I mean? The mighty white Supreme Court has not only got a black justice, they won't concede it, but one of the most brilliant justices, period, Thurgood Marshall, one bad brother. The multicultural government is defined as such because it makes concessions to the Black freedom movement, enacting voting rights and civil rights laws. That is considered to be treason, getting it the false title of multicultural government, because concessions are being made to blacks and people of color. So this is the basis for that. And the key point is, a large number of whites today believe the government favoring blacks and people of color over them. A large number. That is a perception. And they aren't all in this extreme right wing. And their view doesn't just come from the Turner Diaries. It comes from their own feeling, which really arises from their own declining standard of living, which the corporations are largely responsible for. And government policies of neoliberalism carried out under Reagan, where those programs that have benefited people like low-income housing have gone into condos, and where government services have been increasingly privatized. And I've covered this in other shows, how they started this in Chile and other parts of the world, and then brought it to the United States under the Reagan administration. So this is the meaning of multicultural government. He's writing a book that speaks to grievance and dispossession, and a lot of people feel this way. So what else coincides with this Turner Diaries in the real world? Under the Johnson administration, the poverty program is also seen as a part of the multicultural government, because it's seen as being used to benefit people of color, even though it's designed for poor people, not just people of color. And his passage of the Immigration Act in 1965 is, of course, opening the country up, in their view and the view of a lot of whites, to waves of people of color. So this is all what comes under the rubric of multiculturalism, and then those that follow in subsequent administrations. Now, when we also look at the Obama presidency, that would be considered as multicultural government to the extreme, with a black person running it. Now, this just drives them up the wall. And Obama, after leaving office, him and his wife have said they could see how They were a polarizing element among whites. Yeah, well, they feel like they should have all the power. And the White House is viewed as the symbol of power, even though it's the corporations that rule the White House, except in emergencies, like in the case of Roosevelt's New Deal, where if in the emergency the president decides to take authority. Obama had that opportunity and didn't. He could have done a whole lot and would have been a shoo-in for a re-election. Remember when Obama was running against McCain, I remember an interview on TV just before the election, and they're interviewing a Klansman, and they're asking him, who are you going to vote for? And he said, I'm voting for the N. You know, we don't use that word on this show. How desperate you got to be to choose between a military veteran who's white and Obama, you know, Harvard Law School graduate and all that, who's black. But why did he make the choice? Well, the guy he had to choose from, the white one, had 2 feet in the grave and didn't have any answers for this collapsing economy. And he had to admit, well, that, you know, this black man could put a sentence together and he might actually be able to do something. Oh, I have to do this, but oh, it wasn't with any love. You know what I mean? But if there's any example of what would be considered the multicultural government, it would be Obama. You hear me? Do you hear me? This drove a lot of people nuts. Some people couldn't sleep over it. You know what I mean? Talking about white people. Some black people couldn't because they were so excited, especially sisters. Y'all know what I'm talking about. So this is the general perception. Now, the election of Obama to the presidency, the defeat of Trump by a multicultural coalition led by blacks, including, and don't forget this, 33% of the white vote, those that voted, both affirm and contradict this view of the multicultural government because whites are in it. So it isn't just people of color. And obviously, in the case of Biden, he's the president. And even in Obama, when he's president, the bulk of his appointees are white. They ain't black. You know what I mean? So this idea of the multicultural government is false, but it is portraying a fear that whites have, a fear of dispossession, that they are moving into our most treasured places. It used to be in the bedroom. Now it's the White House. What's going to happen next? So this idea of dispossession is central to the Turner Diaries, the defensive wars that people fight, and everything else. When it's not the multicultural government that's the issue, it's not white dispossession that's the issue. The issue is that whites have lost the total and complete power over blacks and people of color. That's the real issue. What they're longing for is the good old days, the days of slavery that slip out of people's mouths like Mitch McConnell when he says in so many words, we ain't citizens. You understand? So when Trump makes the slogan, make America great again, that comes from Hitler's slogan of make Germany great again. But what he actually means, and you all know this, is make America white again. And his specific anger was directed at Barack Obama, the Obama presidency. His birther charge that he wasn't born here, the real point he was saying to white people is, born here or not, they ain't Americans. That's the real point. Born here or not, that's the White House. It ain't no black house. That's his real point. So this stop the steal in 2020 election really was saying that the election was stolen because people who voted black and brown shouldn't have voted. And that's basically what all the gerrymandering and vote rigging now is all about. The media ain't going to present it that way, but I think most of you know that's the way it is. So it should escape no one's notice that the January 6, 2020 insurrection was a direct attack on what many of the insurrectionists, not all, saw as the multicultural government about to dispossess their white adolescent racist fake populist president from the presidency. This is straight out of the Turner Diaries that encouraged attacks on federal government buildings. Now, I'm not saying that all people who took part in January the 6th had read the Turner Diaries. I'm saying the hardcore had. And by their actions, you shall know them. Note, there was a noose hung up on a scaffold for Vice President Pence. Note in the Turner Diaries, it talked about hanging the race traitors. Even the New York Times noted that came straight out of the Turner Diaries. Uh-oh. You hear me? This ain't just smoke. Then there's the Oklahoma City federal bombing in 1995, carried out by Timothy McVeigh, an ex-military veteran, a member of a paramilitary group who claimed he wasn't a racist. I remember Gore Vidal interviewed him in prison and talked about, he said he wasn't a racist, but hey, we're going on your actions. So what's he attacking? He's attacking a symbol of the multicultural government, which in the Turner Diaries is FBI headquarters, which paramilitary attack. In this case, it's a federal building. Who's in that federal building? Largely black and brown and yellow people with their babies, because they also have babysitting in that federal building. So he was himself, he was portrayed as a lone wolf. Most people think that he was a part of a cell operating from a small paramilitary group. He wasn't the sole person that carried that out. But whether he was or not, his organizational base fit the Turner model, highly disciplined, organized groups. An ex-military, someone who had also been disaffected by the treatment of farmers in the Midwest who had been dispossessed by big farms and stuff. So why wasn't his attack against the forces that did that? Guess what? In his back pocket was a copy of the Turner Diaries. Uh-oh. Huh? Now, though the sale of the Turner Diaries was $500,000, you can consider it large or small. Pierce used this to finance his organization, to recruit members, and to increase his propaganda machine. But his major contribution is, as Timothy McVeigh, who comes after him, would indicate, is on subsequent right-wing groups and on mainstream conservative and right-wing political people who are in office or part of campaigns running people for office. So one of the groups that Turner impacts is the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Klan went through three phases. I discussed this before when I dealt with the Civil War and post-Reconstruction. First phase was the phase right after the Civil War, 1865, where Bedford Forrest becomes head of the Klan and suppresses blacks. Bedford Forrest had been a multimillionaire, slave owner, So that's a period of suppression. Some books say that the Klan was suppressed then. That's not true. The Klan rode freely then, not just during post-Reconstruction. in 1876. The second phase is in the 20s, where the Klan resurges again and has millions of members. But it's the old Klan in terms of how it's portrayed and dresses. It's white sheets and boogeyman outfits and all of that. David Duke is like Pierce, and he's influenced by Pierce. He's modernizing the Klan for what was then the 20th and now the 21st century. In the 70s, like Pierce, David Duke was a college graduate. He wasn't a physics major, but college graduate. Good public speaker, good looking. And unlike the old Klan, he didn't wear sheets and was never seen with a gun in his hand. He wore suits. And his major weapon was propaganda. He took out of the page of the Black Freedom, Black Power, Black Panther movement the use of publicity. I mean, King's movement basically won its gains through the march and through publicity, the publicity of horrendous savage whites attacking children and women. And that got him civil rights legislation in Birmingham. And the Raymond Pettis Bridge attack got him voting rights legislation. But it was through the use of the media. You understand? And Duke is drawing from our book. But what he's doing it is for nefarious reasons. Big word, nefarious. Racist, savage reasons. And he's coming disguised as reasonable. I mean, he appears on all the major talk shows, Phil Donahue's show, a host of others. When he shows up in Southern California, he comes in on a rented helicopter, October 16, 1977. He flies into San Ysidro, Southern California. That's in San Diego. And he's going to the Federal Office of Immigration and Naturalization. 100 newspaper reporters are there to meet him, giving him the publicity for the Klan. And what is his message? Indistinguishable from Trump's. This is what he says. We believe very strongly that white people are becoming a second-class citizen in this country. Now, he's using civil rights language, second-class citizen. You understand? In fact, towards the end of his career, he forms a group called the National Association for the Advancement of White People. That's defensiveness for you, but it's being used in a slick way. Now, remember Trump's statement when he comes down the gilded stairs in his hotel. What does he say? Quote, referring to Mexicans, but this is really referring to any people of color coming into this country, but heavily directed at Mexicans, because you have Haitians who are treated worse than just about any group of immigrants who are coming into the country. They don't come in legally. And then they get treated bad racially once they're in the country. So what does he say? You've heard this, but I compare the Duke statement to his. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people. He's a Gemini, so he's always going to throw a little positive in so you can say he's not a racist. Well, it ain't too smart, Donald. What you just said is just plain ass savage. And then he says, but I speak to border guards and they're telling us what we're getting, meaning the border guards, who, by the way, voted heavily for Trump. He claims that's the source for what he's saying. So that's got to be objective and right? Huh? But the key point is the new Klan is identifying immigration as a central issue that they're going to organize around. I didn't mention it, but the Turner Diaries does as well. And It's drawing from a sense of dispossession, in this case, numerical dispossession. We're going to lose in the numbers race. And by this time, they're beginning to see the handwriting on the wall. Again, the result of the 1965 immigration laws, spillover from the Black Freedom Movement. Not intended by us, but it's one we welcome. Let more people of color into this country. So this becomes a central platform for the new right wing. Now, David Duke's got a big problem, and the new right wing has a big problem. How in the hell do you explain blacks kicking your political behinds in the 50s and in the 60s? And if they have to look at it now with Obama and then defeating Trump, how do you explain this? Of course, at this time, these other things, Obama and the defeat of Trump or Trump, hadn't happened. This is in the 70s. But how do you explain this? Because blacks are supposed to be an inferior people. How did you do this? And he goes to the Turner Diaries. But he's also going to the deep well of racism in this country. And he says, well, blacks don't have the brains. It was the Jews. The Jews were behind the scenes manipulating everything. You understand? But that's a good case of underestimating your enemy, because guess what? We led that. Notice in the Turner Diaries, the gun control laws are called the Cohen gun control laws. Cohen's a Jewish name, suggesting that the Jews are taking away our guns. Now, there's never been a Jewish president. Jews don't control the presidency. They don't control the country either. They have their enclave, economic. They don't run the country. Any country that is run by Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or any country run by whites, whatever their religious affiliation is, their power is manifested first through who controls the army, because it's military power that sustains your power, and then who controls the high reaches of corporate power. And that really defines who runs a country. Jews have some corporate power. There ain't been no Jewish president. There's not yet been a Jewish head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They have played roles of advisors to presidents, and they played important roles in other respects. They don't run the country, and blacks make a mistake when they think so. You ain't got the army, you ain't running it. Because ultimately this comes down to force. And then, of course, institutions run the army. I've talked to people who have been in high-ranking positions in the military, and they talk about what happens with 4-star, 3-star, 2-star, and 1-star generals when major corporate heads come through the Pentagon. It's like God came through. And what happens with the highest ranking officers when they retire? They end up sitting on the boards of major corporations. Colin Powell included, though I doubt he got as many boards positions and a lot of others, as is true of Austin, who's Secretary of Defense, a former 4-star general. You understand? Corporations run the military. Corporations basically run this country. And corporations are so good with their publicity that they can often get people to vote against their own interests. All they have to do is put enough money into an ad campaign. And that's a shame. But the point is, according to Pierce, according to Duke, according to the right wing, according to a whole lot of whites, Jews run everything. Really. So what we're seeing with the new right wing is the new right wing is laying out a set of agendas that become popular within both political parties. Note that Obama deported a huge number of people coming from Mexico and other parts of the country. His central objective was to get online with the Republicans to convince them to come along with immigration laws that would allow people who had been defined as illegal in this country to get citizenship. But that's twisted logic. I mean, Mitch McConnell that was out to stop everything you were doing, you think that because you're hard on immigrants coming into this country, that Mitch McConnell's going to side with you. No, his whole thing was to stop you. Didn't you get that point? After a while, he did. It took a while to get it. David Duke, when he was looking at his model of coming up with a new kind of Ku Klux Klan, drew some things from the 1920s period. He didn't draw the sheets, but what he did draw was the mass following. He wanted a mass following because the Klan at this point had over 3 million members. They staged a walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, the main thoroughfare in Washington, D.C., of over 30,000 Klansmen. And of course, the birth of a nation, which glorified the Klan and treated Reconstruction as thievery by blacks and attack on white womanhood and all this kind of stuff. The Klan was at its high point up to the mid-20s, and it then went into decline. So he wanted a mass base. He wasn't able to get a mass base. His base was more the size of Turner's organization, made up of a small group of disciplined people. So the Turner Diaries has its effect on the right wing, and more than the Klan. I'm just running a few. Ronald Reagan gets elected to the presidency in 1980, defeats Jimmy Carter. He announces his presidential campaign where? Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the three civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Swerner, all members of CORE, like talked about under the Black Power series, who are part of the Mississippi Summer Project. He announces his campaign there, saying, like the signifying monkey, that he supported that. That's basically what he was saying. And then he attends a Mississippi state fair where he tells whites that he supports states' rights. States' rights are basically the basis for the first post-Reconstruction, because when the Hayes-Tilden Compromise is sealed, and the agreement is that Hayes can be president on condition he removes federal troops and does a number of other things, it's under the rubric of states' rights, that the states will be free to do to blacks as they choose. And that was basically the message that he was delivering when he ran for president. And then he identifies blacks as welfare queens. And he has this mythical example of a black person who was driving big Cadillacs and making all kinds of money through welfare fraud. This lays the foundation. This picture of blacks chiseling on welfare, when in fact the majority of people on welfare are white, gives the cover for Bill Clinton to end welfare as a lifetime benefit, and without much of an upsurge coming from blacks to oppose it. Because you had some blacks confused. Oh, I don't like welfare anyway. You know what I mean? Huh. Well, yeah, welfare could be improved. But welfare is better than no fare. And what's happening with poor black women, poor Latino women, poor white women, whatever their ethnicity is, after 5 years, if they can't find a job that can pay above minimum wage, they're not going to be able to support their own children. And so again, this is a part of the new right, in this case, manifested through Reagan and through his policies against the poor. And he basically raises poverty in America. While the Chinese have lowered poverty by 500 million, this country has not really seriously tackled it. In fact, in many ways, it's getting worse. So in understanding Trump's move to seize the presidency through voter legislation that restricts the black, brown, and youth vote, and through gerrymandering, is to understand that this achieves what Trump tried to achieve in January 6th and other efforts to overthrow the legal presidential election of 2021. So through this method, he's making what's illegal legal so that he can carry out a legal steal. And with the Democrats not able to pass federal voting rights legislation and the Supreme Court having stripped the voting rights law of its enforcement provision by saying that the states where blacks are most likely to be denied the right to vote don't need to be supervised anymore. Those are the very states and others who are enacting all of these restrictive laws. And because two Democrats couldn't get on board, and one had actually written a voting rights legislation, wasn't as good as the one that John Lewis had put together, but it was, better than nothing. He opposes his own legislation because he doesn't want to end the filibuster. So if we're going to understand this legal steal, which is really illegal, but making the illegal legal, you're not going to understand this unless you understand the effort by powerful elite forces in this country in 1934 to overthrow the federal government. Those of you that already know about this, put on those who are doing the chat, put on the chat that you've read the book or that you know about this. You know about this effort to overthrow the government in 1934. I'd like to see how many people knew this. Anybody? Put it up if you have. And before I get into this, I'll respond to a few questions up here. Loud to Zoo asks, should we monitor right-wing radio and other media sources? Sure. Keep up on what they're saying and read their literature. Yeah, definitely. Loud to Zoo, he's talking to somebody else. Let's see. Question, in your view, the Vice President Kamala Harris, with the possibility of her becoming president, elevate whites' fear of dispossession? Yeah, and it'll be very difficult for her to win, too. Very difficult. Yeah, of course it will. But not all whites. Because, again, remember, a third white split on almost anything they do. So be clear about that. See if there's any others before I get into this piece here. Loud to Zoo question, Dr. Tashaka, is the book The Turner Diaries a resurrection of Birth of a Nation? How does the right-wing talk radio contribute to the development of the new right? The right-wing talk contributes greatly because you have a number of shows that have millions and millions of listeners and in some case viewers. And so it plays a big part. And the Turner Diaries were written well after the Birth of a Nation. And so the Birth of a Nation reaffirms this idea that Reconstruction and everything else was an attack on civilization, that blacks were unable to run government and misappropriated money, raped women, all of this stuff, when in fact, blacks, through Reconstruction governments, created the first free public schools in the South and created all kinds of measures that improved the lives of not only blacks, but other people. Let's see if there's anything else here before I get into this other part. Lungsta M makes a comment that South Africa has a right-wing group called the AWB, Africana Woordstand Bing Wing Jing Africana Resistance Movement, Africana nationalist, neo-Nazi, and white supremacist paramilitary organization. Yeah, and they're all over the world, you know. And in fact, there's collaboration between these groups. Sylvia Stewart, we're fighting Trumpism manifested in our governor. Okay. See if there's any others here. Okay, I'm sure there's some others that'll come in. I'll get to those when I finish. So I gave you time to see if anybody put up their knowledge of this 1934 attempt to overthrow the U.S. government. Interesting. You would think that an attempt to overthrow a government, and this is far more serious than January 6th, because while there are a lot of whites that took part in January 6th, a large number attacking the U.S. Capitol, they didn't have the kind of forces that could even think about overthrowing the government. You need firepower of a maximum level. They didn't have it. Now, the Joint Chiefs, the head of the Capitol Police, the FBI, they all were slow to do anything. Well after hours of acting out by the January 6th so-called insurrectionists, and only after Trump told them to stop, after he enjoyed everything they did and incited it. But January the 6th did not threaten the overthrow of this government, by no means. I mean, to do that, you would have to have a Russia situation where the people in power are so weak they're about ready to fall. That's called a coup d'etat. A small force can take power. That's not what's within the likelihood then, certainly not in January the 6th. So what happens in 1934 is more serious because of the forces behind it. And so you would think you'd all know about this. You would think that it would be a part of your public school curriculum, you know, when the right wing is now trying to ban anything on black, brown, red, or yellow people. This is white history. You'd think this would be in your white history books. It's not. And you'll see why in a minute. And I don't blow smoke. You're not going to hear me say something unless I can back it up. So where did I get this from? It's from a book called Facts and Fascism. The author is a guy named George Seldes, S-E-L-D-E-S. This is a book that I've had since the 70s. It's a privately published book. And so a lot of people will discredit it because, like, my books are privately published. So you'll say, well, yeah, that's just the view of the author. Well, the reason it was privately published is ain't no major publisher in this country going to publish that. And since they now know about it, none have chosen to even do new investigative reports on this to publish that. And no major politicians have talked about this. The other source for this is General Smedley Butler, 3-star Marine Corps general. This guy that you saw on the leaflet, the one in the dark there with his gray hair and a military uniform, 3-star, former commandant of the Marine Corps, 2-time Congressional Medal of Honor winner, who called American wars a racket. You understand? He's the other source. And when everyone else tapped down on this and refused to report this, he went on a speaking tour and talked about it. And the first time I heard about this, after I got this book, was some TV show that was a detective show where it referred to this. You know, it's kind of like inserting it in a way that's not going to be threatening. So it's important to understand this because you need to understand the forces you're up against is not only the new right, but certain reactionary forces who are within the powerful elite. And I want to point out that January the 6th, so far, you don't see corporate involvement. The problem with the January 6th insurrection, the way it's handled is they've gone after the small fry. They haven't gone after anybody big, unless you consider the head of one of these paramilitary groups to be big, and hardly any of them got any sentences. But so far, you don't see the corporate hand here, and clearly this was something triggered by Trump and those who support him that rallied behind him. So what I'm going to discuss here is got to do with a move that had heavy corporate backing. And to understand this, you need to understand some background. In the 30s, big business, a large sector, not all, but a large sector of big businessmen in this country opposed Franklin Delano Roosevelt's policies of the New Deal. His policies saved the country from a depression. Some said it was World War II, but actually, generally, it was the New Deal. And then, of course, World War II put everybody to work, blacks being last, after and only after A. Philip Randolph threatened to march on Washington did we start getting hired. One of the reasons they opposed this New Deal is Roosevelt imposed a 90% tax on the rich, and that went on until the Reagan administration. And you might say that's an awful lot. Well, given the awful lot that they have, what's wrong with them spreading some of that out, especially with people that had no food, couldn't afford to have a roof over their head, were just flat. Now, of course, blacks have faced this all the time, though some of us have been able to come out of it. For whites, blacks, brown, red, yellow, everybody red in this country, the majority of them were flat out. So Roosevelt's New Deal policies were designed to save capitalism, because at that time you had an active Communist Party. There was fear among large circles of the rulers of this country that this country could face an overthrow. The fact is, the left wing wasn't strong enough to do it, but who knows over time what could have happened. So Roosevelt implements New Deal policies under the Works Projects Administration. And that was a lot of public work projects, something that Obama should have considered when he faced the 2008 economic crisis. The New Deal included Social Security, which if the Republicans get the presidency in both houses, they will ban. And Trump indicated that he'd be open to it in a second term. He had promised his base he would protect the benefits, especially Social Security, and didn't touch them in the first term because he wanted to be reelected. But in the second term, he doesn't have to worry about reelection. And Bush was well on the way to doing it, except for the wars that he triggered. It got him bogged down. So Social Security was a major thing coming out of the Roosevelt administration. And you had federal housing. And under Reagan, they cut the federal housing budget substantially. And now you have condos for the rich and no housing for poor people or even moderate income people. You have a lot of poor people, a lot of blacks who are homeless who have jobs. But they're not making enough on their jobs to pay the rent, let alone to buy a house. And then he created the Federal Housing Project, or Federal Housing Administration. And I should point out, blacks largely didn't benefit from Social Security or the federal housing policies in the beginning because Southerners were able to insert into the New Deal provisions that it wouldn't cover, they didn't say blacks, but people working in certain areas, largely sharecropping or working in homes doing domestic work. It defined black labor. Later, we got into those benefits. And in the South, the GI Bill didn't even work for blacks, you know. But the point is, the rich, a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them oppose this. So if we're going to look at the new right, we need to also look at right-wing policies of those in power. So in this book, Facts and Fascism, on page 68, the author makes this comment. Thurman Arnold, Assistant Attorney of the United States, and his assistant Norman Littell, and several congressional investigations have produced incontrovertible evidence that some of the biggest monopolies entered into secret agreements with the Nazi cartels to divide the world between them. So this is the first thing, you know. Different sectors of the American economy, that is, business leaders, helped finance Hitler's war machine. The aluminum industry provided aluminum to Hitler so much, I pointed this out in a previous show, that after Pearl Harbor happened, the U.S. didn't have enough aluminum to build airplanes, you know. And it's commonly known that Henry Ford was a major supporter of Hitler, was an anti-Semite, was against the Jews. But it was a whole sector of American corporations that helped build up the Nazi war machine and helped build their advanced tanks. The Germans had better tanks in World War II than the Americans had. So what's also not generally known, and some books now are starting to explore this, and one of the books on the book list that I was reading earlier referred to this, is that Hitler's Third Reich was modeled after the United States. So if you think about, well, oh, it's terrible, these corporations collaborated with the Nazis, you know what I mean? It wasn't just the right wing who were pushing Nazi propaganda. But it was the fact that Americanism was founded on genocide. Hitler studied that. It was a basis for the genocide against Jews, gypsies, socialists, gays, anyone in opposition to his government. You had the most advanced eugenics programs in the world where, you know, they're operating on people because they have low IQs or something. And, you know, they're doing all kinds of experimentation on what they consider to be inferior people, who are people with might have some health disability. That became central to the Third Reich, and they would operate on Jews with no, medication, just as they did on enslaved Africans in this country, you know. Hitler looked at American ghettos and reservations that Jews were held on, and that was the model for ghettoization of Jews. So the U.S. was the model. And the fact that they had a lot in common is confirmed by the fact that after Germany's defeated, America's incorporating all kinds of Nazis into their intelligence agencies, into their scientific institutions and others. You understand? And suddenly the boogeyman isn't the former Nazis, it's the Russians who saved you from the Nazis. What kind of logic is that? So what is generally not known today is that large sectors of the US white ruling elite supported Hitler and Mussolini, and leading members of leading corporations met with representatives of both fascist Italy and fascist Germany. The American Legion, it's a major supporter of Mussolini. The American Legion was set up by big business, and they're made up of ex-military, but heavily highly ranked military people, and they would play a role in this 1934 attempt to overthrow the American government. Now, again, coming from this book, Facts and Fascism, and these can all be documented, found through other documentation. The author says this: the most important documentary evidence exists in the files of the first Un-American Committee. These are committees that were later called the House on Un-American Activities Committee that went after people that they called communists. But he's saying the evidence for this plot to overthrow the government comes from the files of the Un-American Committee, predecessor to what was called the Dies Committee, a committee that was active in Congress in the 30s. The story of this attempt to overthrow the U.S. government was suppressed in 99% of the American press and by the political establishment. And of course, the economic elite wasn't going to say anything about it at all. So this is again the plot. Quote, in 1934, leading members of the American Legion conspired with Wall Street brokers and other big businessmen to upset the government of the United States and to establish a fascist regime. You hear me? Now, in some of the meetings, and I don't have time to go into all of this, but it's documented, they actually had mimeographed copies of the meetings where German officials met with corporate leaders of the United States, talking about the Germans saying they didn't like Roosevelt's policies, but they can't interfere in the internal affairs of America. But if Americans decide to oppose Roosevelt, they're sure that they could get the German Americans to side with the Nazi position. And they went on to say that they had succeeded in suppressing labor in Germany. The Nazis had, because that was the real point. They had reduced their standard of living, that is the amount of money they made per hour, and they had disciplined the labor force by putting them under the fascist government. And that they thought that that would be a good model for the United States, which is something that's being done now. Under Reagan, labor unions begin to be busted. And so now you're working 2 or 3 jobs for nothing. That's happened now. So this isn't all pie in the sky right-wing talk. So this was a conspiracy to overthrow this government, replace it with a fascist government. And when the Germans met with American industrial leaders, many of them said, yeah, they like what Hitler was doing. They like what Mussolini was doing. It'd be much better than what Roosevelt was doing. The big mistake of the plotters was they went to Smedley Butler. They went on his reputation of being a 3-star, of 2 Congressional Medals of Honor winner, of invading China and Haiti and all the rest, which he described as gangster operations when he retired. And in fact, he addressed some of these same groups, telling them that. So why would they be so stupid to go to him? So they asked Smedley Butler, retired 3-star Marine Corps general, former commander of the United States Marine Corps, to head up the American push against the federal government, leading its overthrow. And the American Legion was the one that approached him, and they had the backing of these various corporate heads. And that would mean that this ain't going to be no peaceful march. I mean, you ain't taking the government peacefully. It would make January the 6th look like a little picnic, because we're going to take the government. It's going to get bloody. So when they asked Smedley Butler, he refused. He insisted on exposing the plot. He went to the Congress, and the Congress shut it down, but never prosecuted a single participant in this and didn't mention it publicly. Why? Because these are the people that own America. Not all of them, because all of them didn't participate, but a significant number. And so there ain't no way in the world they're going to be putting down the people in charge. The mass media became silent on this. And as I pointed out, Smedley Butler went to the lecture circuit to expose this. So there are some direct comparisons between the 1934 attempt and the new right and the Trump right-wing orientation. Both have a Nazi racist orientation. Now, Trump has never called himself a Nazi, but he has racist views, and some of those are the same that the Nazis and others who aren't Nazis advocate. In case of the new right and the 1934 effort, their overall objective is to overthrow the federal government. What Trump brings to the picture is different from what the new right had before. They rallied behind him, but never before in the history of this country have you had a base like Trump's. In the last election, 74.2 million votes compared to Biden's 81.2 million. The Biden vote was substantially larger, and that put Trump in the doghouse. But 74.2 million, largely loyal voters, 4 million of which are new voters, is significant. Trump, like the new right and Wall Street, the Wall Street elite, tried to overthrow the US government in 1934. Trump wanted to overthrow the democratic procedures for electing a president, which is pretty close to a similar thing, because you're installing someone illegally into the highest political office of the country who's not supposed to be there. In the case of the January 6th insurrection, the FBI, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Capitol Police, and other leadership ignored warning signals that was all over the internet, and therefore only acted after really hours of bloody demonstrations. And then only then does Trump tell people to go home. So like the 1934 effort where the top leaders haven't been touched, if there were any top leaders, and it didn't have to be corporate, it could be political leaders, so far they haven't been touched. The key point that needs to be stressed here is that the January 6, 2020 uprising was a move carried out because Trump's forces had been defeated by a multicultural coalition led by Blacks. So January 6th was a defensive move and one they lost. But the now legal stop to steal is one that is designed to secure the election for the president and make it easier for them to take the House and the Senate when whites are in fact a declining proportion of the American population, both numerically and voting-wise. So the rule in war, as I said before, is know your enemy, know yourself. This knowledge should help you in better understanding the forces you're up against and how to deal with it. Some of your strengths some of theirs and their weaknesses. So what can we do about this? First, consciousness is extremely important. And there's an awakening that's occurring among Black youth, the hip hop generation. The whole Black Lives Matter around the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor uprising was a reflection of that. The way in which the youth organized was a reflection of that. So it's an indication that a sector of our youth have learned a lot and have pulled out of the playbook of the Black Power, Black Freedom movements of the 60s certain lessons and then added those of their own. And the most important lesson they've drawn, I think, is group-centered leadership that is absolutely essential for a process of community revitalization that we need now, because this is more than electoral stuff. We have to hit the streets more, and not around singular leadership, but group-centered leadership. Why? Because the problems are multiple. It's going to take multiple leadership to solve them. I said this before, and I've been pushing this for a good 20, 25 years. A lot of older Blacks don't want to hear this because we're addicted to charismatic leadership. And there's nothing wrong with charisma. That's our culture. We like the word. But that can't be what determines our programs, how we organize, our strategies and tactics. So awakening is key to that. And there's an awakening going on among Black youth. Sixfold Stages to Mental Freedom is like the pristine system for transforming consciousness. And I've been encouraging people to sign up for that. You can go to my page, otashakasbcglobal.net, and let me know that you're interested in enrolling in this. And we have to have a minimum of 40 people to start this. It'll be a year-long webinar where we're going into the system for deepening our sense of self-knowledge, self-respect, and self-love around specific things that we're doing in our community. So this is key. Kwame Ture, who we discussed last week, formerly Stokely Carmichael, had a popular saying. Wherever he went, he would say, ready for the revolution. And then he would say, organize, organize, organize. And so the real issue for us is extending the organization of Black folks in our community around many different issues and many different institutions to revitalize our communities. So this is extremely important because the mass base that defeated Trump came from different sectors of organized groups in the Black community hooking up with other sectors in the Latino, Asian, and among white youth communities. And those together produced some change. But for us, the first change has got to be inside our own communities. Right now, we have a madness of Black on Black violence. And of course, the madness of police violence, which these movements have at least tackled, though not been able to change. So we have to address both the police violence aimed at Blacks, and our movements have been addressing that, and we have to address the Black on Black violence and stop it. And we know we didn't cause this. We know that drugs were put in our communities, a primary cause. We know that in most Black communities where the killing rate is high, there are a few shooters who are doing most of the killing. Some of this killing is something where some gang rival is shooting at another and kills somebody else. But a lot of it you can identify in communities by identifying the shooters. And some communities have, particularly Black mayors and stuff, have provided ways for handling this. But the key point is a lot of our youth have been put in desperate positions. And I'm specifically speaking of the youth without high skills, because we have a sector of our youth highly educated. right? They also have problems finding a job. And the average educated, college educated Black person earns 6 times less than whites. In fact, earns what a white high school graduate earns. So that's the nature of what skills too often produce for us. But for the unskilled young Blacks, male and female, um, they're put in a desperate position, surrounded by death in many of their communities. So many of them have a philosophy that says, I'm not afraid to live, uh, I'm not afraid to die, I'm afraid to live. And that's because death is so certain that it makes life uncertain. And so a lot of our youth are put in that position where they're sometimes taking unnecessary risks because they don't see the value in life. And we see the rise in suicide rates, even though they're lower, except for 7 to 11-year-olds than whites. So we have to address this. And this is going to take a different kind of organizing to address this, because you're going to have to meet the needs of a lot of young people who are in this position. And I would suggest the biggest need is both psychological, cultural, but especially economic. We're going to have to address economic needs, both on the job front and on the business development front. And that's got to be a major thing. And I'm not saying I have the answers for this. This is something that comes out of our people. They're going to have to come up with these answers. I'm just pointing out some key areas. When it comes to vote rigging, the best way to beat Trump has been pretty well defined by Obama and been defined by our success in defeating Trump. And that is when you have a steal that's on, and this steal is worse than any other steal since post-Reconstruction 1 in 1876, where Blacks in the South were just completely driven out of the ballot box. So in this particular area, your best strategy is going to be to overwhelm the system with Black votes. Overwhelm it. Brown, red, yellow, and white youth votes, and that 1/3 of white votes. But it's going to take that to defeat Trump. And Trump's strength is his weakness. His strength is that he appeals to a large sector of white people. And that's his weakness, because he only appeals to a large sector of white people. That number of Blacks that he got, the confused Black youth, that increased number of Latinos he got, those were small numbers. 86% of Blacks overall voted for Biden against Trump, and the overwhelming majority of Latinos voted against him as well. So the overall electoral strategy has to be, at the local level, do as much as you can to throw out as much of these restrictions, and at the state level, as much as you can, politically and legally. And some of that is happening. It still means that there's going to be a tremendous legal steal that's illegal set up through legislation. So this is key. And so rather than Black people being discouraged, you better be encouraged, because the main battlefield is not the electoral front, it's community organizing. But if you lose the White House, then it's harder on you, because you're going to have, particularly under right-wing governments, more forces coming after you. The fact that Obama was in office during the rise of Black Lives Matter gave them some breathing room. There were some things that he didn't do to them that Trump would have done. And one reason why Trump didn't move on Black Lives Matter during his administration is Black Lives Matter nationally, contrary to what some of their leaders said, was largely silent. And they were smart, because this boy has attention deficit disorder. I don't mean it literally, I'm joking. But it means as long as he ain't seeing it, he ain't thinking about it. The boy don't read. He don't think about too much except himself. So they were smart to keep themselves visibly off of, the front page. But when the time was right, the people rose up, and then Black Lives Matter had some relevance because it was the people. So in the end, the answers to all of this is our people. And I have a lot of confidence in our people, especially the youth. Because the Black Lives Matter movement is an indication that the hip hop generation has come of age politically. They've been of age in a lot of ways, but politically, they got a lot more to deal with. And so this show is dedicated to reach out to the younger generation and offer whatever we can to you while drawing from you. And I thank the younger people who have stepped forward to help us build this show. So that's it. Remember, you're in a period of history of the decline of the United States, the decline and fall of Western Europe, the rise of the East, China now, Africa tomorrow, and the shift in power demographically between whites and people of color. And not all whites, because some have enough sense to be a part of this shift because they care about something that has to do with humanity. But the tide of history is on your side. The obstacles that are being put before you are difficult. But your greatest weapon is your culture. And your ethos is creativity. And the one thing you can say about you, that I can say about my people, is the one thing you can't do about us is predict what we're going to do. That's your greatest strength in war. Surprise. You know what I mean? So I don't know what surprises our people have in store for the system. But I know if you know the truth, you're in a position to be the truth and to produce change. So I want to see if there are any other comments or questions that are relevant for this discussion. Sylvia Stewart, and during this COVID pandemic, healthcare organization laid off certified nursing assistants, the most vulnerable members of the healthcare team, low wage earning women. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah, that's important. And during this COVID pandemic healthcare crisis, some of us have taken the wrong stand. I know that's not popular with some of you, but I have to say it. Get your shots. The people who are dying are mainly the people who don't have shots. Look at facts. Check out the facts. See who's dying and who's living. And live. There's a comment here. Bitcoin established during Trump administration. NCAA transfer portal open during the Trump viewpoint. PPE loans and grants were doghouse money opened up during the Trump administration. Yeah, well, most of the money that Trump opened up went to big fat cats. It did not go to everyday people. And blacks lost 40% of our businesses during this period. He not only mismanaged COVID, but he deliberately set up a rescue package for the rich. Question. Ephraim Davis, do you believe the ADOS movement is connected to the right wing? We're going to do a series on reparations. And I did a show on ADOS, maybe the third or fourth show that we did. Dr. Raymond Wimbush, who's an authority on reparations, and a sister from Haiti, who's a citizen of the United States and also an expert on ADOS, did a really great job of exposing ADOS. Here's the deal on ADOS. and it's coming from them because they're the experts on this. ADOS originally started off as an anti-immigration organization. And it was not an organization that was opposed to white immigrants. It was opposed to black immigrants, brown immigrants, red and yellow, but especially black. And they still are, because they've got this whole term for what it means to be an African American, fundamental African Americans or something like this, fundamental Americans. But they treat anyone coming from the Caribbean or Africa as people who are poaching on our rights, saying that they come in and take our jobs from us and all this stuff. So I'm going to critique this in a minute, but here's the key point. They only take off when they link anti-immigrationism to reparations, but tying it to an anti-immigrant, heavily anti-black immigrant spiel. And what I want to say about ADOS is they're very good. The people who lead ADOS, they're good propagandists. They are very good. You know what I mean? And for a group of young people or anyone who's black, who's not politically conscious, some of them could fall for the line, because, for example, it is common for immigrants of any ethnic group to outpace their group because they come in with this drive to thrive and survive. And so, as a result, they are usually, more aggressive economically and other ways. And then they level off as they become a part of their particular group, whether Mexicans or black or whatever. In the case of Asians, the recent immigrants have been highly educated. So that's a whole different story there. But the key point is, note that ADOS ain't opposing white immigration into this country. They're opposing black immigration. And their story on that is false. You can't separate the wheat from the chaff. You can't say that we shouldn't be having Africans from the Caribbean, but only Africans from here. Well, who are the Africans from here? We came from Africa, number one, and a lot of us came from the Caribbean. A lot of South Carolina blacks come from the Caribbean. If you're going to say that people from the Caribbean shouldn't be African Americans, then you're going to miss the fact that Denmark Vesey came from the Dutch West Indies, spent time as an enslaved person in Haiti, and was then rebought by his slave master. I pointed this out before because he faked epileptic fits, which he no longer had once he got rebought, won a lottery, and led the best slave rebellion, that is the best organized, best planned slave rebellion in the history of U.S. insurrection. So you're going to say he shouldn't have been here? Well, first of all, he's being brought in here as a slave. So understand, enslaved Africans came from every part of the world, not just Africa, but by way of Africa, the Caribbean, some South America, here. You understand? So this is a false idea. And it's interesting that ADOS, in their demand for reparations, have only put the demand on Democrats. You did not hear them putting in any demands on the Republican administration of Trump for reparations. The demand was placed on the Democrats. And what they tell with this slick propaganda is this: go to the Democrats and demand reparations. And if you don't get them, don't vote for them. And since neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party has advanced any legislation for reparations, and prominent Democrats have voiced their opposition, so you know what they're going to do when you go to them. So why don't you go to the Republicans and tell them to do the same thing? So, yeah, I think that they're heavily linked. You know what I mean? And we're going to do a series of shows where people who are part of the real reparations movement come on and discuss the aims and objectives of reparations. And let's see what they do about that. I don't care. Uzziah Kepo says, looked up Turner Diaries and fell upon George Jackson's activism and Black August. Thank you. Yeah, good. It's funny when you're looking for one thing, what you find in another place. Yeah, the title for ADOS is American Descendants of Slaves, meaning you're not African, you're not African American, you're just a slave descendant, which also means that you have no connection to Africa. You know, I mean, this is a made up identity. And I don't knock people who take this on because I don't think they know any better. But I knock the people who are running the propaganda, the leaders of this, because they have had an association with these right-wing groups. So are they created by the right wing? They certainly have had right-wing connections. I guess this is a question. Are the Japanese getting involved in reparations for blacks? I don't know of any, but I'm not saying they aren't. I know that blacks encouraged the Japanese reparations movement, supported it, and when they were put in concentration camps, because I come from San Francisco, live in Oakland now, some of them held on to Japanese property when they were put in concentration camps and gave them their property back when they came out. And the black community, the Fillmore, had been the Japanese American community until it was, the Japanese were put in concentration camps. Okay, that looks like it's it. So, Hotep, the key thing I want you to do is to encourage people to subscribe. And if you haven't subscribed, to subscribe, get other people too. The algorithms here don't work for us. It doesn't like our message. But if you like it, spread the message to other people. And I do know this, people are telling me they got their families watching this. You can't tell that when you're looking at analytics. That means the children are watching it, the mother, the grandmother. If that's happening, let me know, because we like to know who we are reaching. And if you have topics that you want us to cover, let me know. You know what I mean? And this is a place for you. And there's a lot of work that I put in to prep on this. When I taught at San Francisco State, I did 3 hours prep for every class I taught. I was never late, taught 16,000 students. And here, this is as important as that. And so I want to give you information that's solid. You'll always hear me citing sources and stuff so that I'm not just giving you an opinion. And then you go out and do your own homework. Think for yourself. And I hope that people enroll in Sixfold Stages to Mental Freedom, Tashaka at sbcglobal.net. And I've enjoyed this. And thank you for your interest. And until next week, Hotep.